Hey everyone. Today, we're looking at the case of Gary Wayne Ferris, a successful attorney from Georgia, a husband, a father, and the person who held a large family system together for many years. At first glance, this story could have started as a simple concern. A grown man was not answering his phone, and his family began searching for him on their own farm. But within just a few hours, it would become clear that there would be no simple explanation. July 5th, 2018, Cherokee County, Georgia. Gary's youngest daughter, Amanda, came over to see her mother, Melody Ferris. During their conversation, something strange came up pretty quickly. Gary had not been heard from since July 3rd. In a large home, that does not immediately feel like a disaster. There are a lot of rooms, a lot of things going on, and people can go for a while without crossing paths. But there were details that made it hard to simply say, he probably just left. Gary's Mercedes was still at the house. His sleep machine was there too. That mattered to the family because he normally did not go anywhere without it. His phone was silent. No one could give a clear answer about where he was or why he was not responding. By the way, for those of you who like breakdowns where we do not invent things, but calmly put the facts together into a clear story, support the channel with a like. It helps us make these episodes more often and go deeper into the details. Scott joined the search. He lived on the same property in the apartment above the barn, so he was able to check the grounds quickly. Christopher arrived later. They looked through the house, the work areas, the outbuildings, and the land around the property. At first, they were not thinking about a crime. Gary had health issues, and his family considered the possibility that he may have had a medical emergency somewhere on the farm. But then their attention shifted to the spot on the property where trash and wood were burned. It was about 100 yards from the house. That is where human remains were found. At first, there was still a possibility that this had been an accident. Maybe someone had gone near the fire, lost consciousness, and could not get out. But even in those first hours, that theory did not answer the biggest question. If Gary owned this land and knew every part of it, how did his path end right there? And why could no one explain what had happened to him for 2 days? To understand why that discovery on the farm immediately shook the entire family, we need to go back. Not to the crime itself, but to the man without whom this whole family system simply did not work. Gary Wayne Ferris was born on June 27, 1960, in Alabama. He was the oldest in the family and grew up with 2 sisters and a brother. From an early age, he had a clear goal. He wanted to become an attorney. Not, maybe I'll figure it out someday. Not, we'll see where life takes me. But one specific profession that he worked toward for years. And this part matters. Gary was not handed some perfect, polished life. Everything that would later surround him, the house, the land, the status, the money, did not appear overnight. He met Melody when he was still a teenager. Their relationship started young, and early in adulthood, they became husband and wife. Almost right away, their family began to grow. First came Christopher, then Scott, and later Emily and Amanda. Melody took care of the home and their sons and daughters, while Gary was balancing work, school, and the path toward a legal career. He worked nights to keep the family afloat, while continuing his education at the same time. The early years did not look like the life of a well-off family. Vacations were rare, extra money was limited, and the pressure on Gary kept growing. But he never stepped off the path he had chosen. After passing the bar exam, he slowly began to establish himself in the legal field. For him, this was not just a job with a solid income. It was proof that all those years of pressure, long hours, and sacrifice had actually meant something. Inside the family, Gary was not just the person bringing in the money. He stayed involved as a father. He showed up for school events and sports, helped with his oldest son's baseball team, and did not disappear from family life, even though his work took up a lot of his time. His sons and daughters called him Big Daddy. The nickname fit both his large build and the role he played at home. In 1995, Gary's career took a major step forward. He was offered the chance to open a law firm office in Atlanta and become the managing partner. After that, the family moved into a completely different level of life. Opportunities opened up that they had never had before. A nice home, financial stability, support for their sons and daughters, and a wider social circle. But this is the part you have to keep in mind. When one person spends years handling almost every major family issue, the people around him can slowly become dependent on that. At first, it looks normal. A father helps, a husband provides, and the family leans on him. But over time, the lines can blur. Where does care end? And where does the habit of relying on him begin? Where does gratitude turn into the expectation that he will step in and fix everything again? At this point in the story, there are no charges yet, no courtroom, and no answers. There is only a family that, from the outside, seemed to rise because of Gary. But the higher his status became, the more people in that house were connected in one way or another to his money, his decisions, and his support. And later, that would make the question of his death far more complicated than a simple accident theory. After Gary's career took off, the family could afford more than just a comfortable house. They could afford land, space, and room to spread out. In 2013, Gary and Melody bought a property on Purcell Lane in Cherokee County. It was a full farm, about 10 acres, with a main house, a barn, pastures, trees, a pond, equipment, driveways, and a work area where trash and wood were burned. For Melody, that home became an important family project. The property was set up so their sons and daughters, relatives, and close friends could come over. Not just stop by for 5 minutes, but really gather, sit down at the table, spend the day on the land, spread out into different rooms, and not be in each other's way. For a family that had spent years working toward financial security, that property looked like the natural result of everything they had pushed through before. But in this story, the most important thing was not what the farm looked like. It was how it was laid out. Purcell Lane was a private property where different areas sat close to each other, but did not blend into one open space. The house, the barn, the equipment area, the outbuildings, and the burn pile where trash and wood were disposed of. All of it was part of everyday life there. And that is exactly why, later on, every route across that farm would be looked at closely. Melody handled the house herself. She kept things in order, managed the day-to-day routine, and as far as we know, she was not eager to hire anyone to clean. In a large home, that is not a small detail. When someone runs the household on their own, they know where things are, which paths people usually take, which doors get used, which rooms matter, and all the little details of daily life. In ordinary circumstances, that is just routine. In an investigation, those details can become important. Scott did not live in the main house. He lived above the barn. After serving in the military, he stayed close to his parents and helped around the property. He had his own separate space, but he was still inside the same family compound. That is not an accusation, and it is not a hint. It is simply a fact. On Purcell Lane, a person could live separately and still be very close to the house. The others were already building their own lives, but the farm remained the family's gathering place. An address like that can give the impression of a solid home base. Grown sons and daughters coming by, parents hosting loved ones, the property serving as a shared space for the family. At the same time, the layout of the land made it impossible to explain someone's absence with one simple sentence. A person could walk out of the house and head toward the barn, the equipment, the animals, or the burn area, and each of those routes would make sense. So when Gary disappeared, Purcell Lane became more than just a place to search. It became a map that investigators had to read carefully. Who could have gone where, what they could have used, and why an ordinary farm property created so many questions. To understand why there was so much tension under the surface in the Ferris family, we have to go back to Gary and Melody's relationship before the final events on the farm. From the outside, they had a long family history. A shared home, grown sons and daughters, a familiar circle of relatives, financial comfort, and status. But inside that marriage, there had been problems for a long time. Problems that could not be fixed with a nice property purchase or a family dinner. One of the serious cracks was Melody's relationship with Ted Wiley. There is no need to pile on extra drama here. The key point is this. For Gary, it became a reason to consider divorce. And in a family like this, divorce is not just an emotional split. It means property, accounts, lifestyle, family roles, and the question of who gets what when the marriage ends. Back then, the divorce did not happen. Gary stayed in the marriage, and later, he and Melody ended up on Purcell Lane. From the outside, it may have looked like a new chapter, a large property, a home, family gatherings, a place where loved ones could come together. But old problems do not disappear just because the address changes. When trust has been damaged, a new property is not always a fresh start. Sometimes, it is just a different place for the same conflicts. Later, someone else entered Melody's life. Roy Barton Jr., known as Rusty. He lived in Tennessee, and her communication with him became its own separate thread, hidden from the usual family picture. Case materials mentioned a separate phone that Melody used to stay in touch with him. The phone itself does not prove a crime, but it does show that this family had another private layer to it. At the same time, tension around money was growing. Gary paid close attention to spending, kept an eye on the accounts, and did not want major expenses going unexplained. More and more household and family spending went through him. In a home where he had been the main earner and the person handling financial decisions for years, that fit the role he had always played. But in a relationship where trust has already been damaged, money control rarely stays calm. Gary himself was not a simple, contradiction-free figure either. Court records brought up his close relationship with a legal assistant named Angela Phillips. That detail does not need to be blown out of proportion. It does not make other people part of the crime, and it does not change the center of the case. What it does show is something else. By that point, the Ferris marriage could no longer be described with a simple line like, "A husband and wife were just living together." On Purcell Lane, that distance became part of everyday life. One house, One last name, one property, but different routines, separate spaces, and not much real shared ground between Gary and Melody. And for investigators, the key question was not who loved whom. The more important question was this: who benefited from keeping the marriage intact on paper, if in reality it was being held together by the house, the money, and the familiar family structure? Now let's go back to the first hours after the discovery on the farm. When authorities arrived at Purcell Lane, they did not yet have a clear picture of a crime. The remains had been found in the area where trash and wood were burned. On a property like that, it was a normal work area, so the first theory sounded simple. Gary may have ended up near the fire, had a medical emergency, and been unable to get away. That idea did not come out of nowhere. Gary had health issues, and his family knew that. So at first, investigators considered the possibility that he had been handling tasks on the property, walked over to the burn area, started feeling unwell, and then things moved into a tragic outcome. At that early stage, it was a theory that had to be checked. But almost immediately, the scene itself raised questions. The remains had been heavily affected by fire, and that made it difficult to close the case as a simple household accident. If Gary had walked to the fire on his own, investigators had to understand his route. If he had used equipment to get there, they had to look at where that equipment was parked. If he had gone on foot, they had to explain why he would choose that path across a large farm, where using property equipment would usually make more sense. Checking the property became an important part of the case. Investigators were not only looking at the place where the remains were found, they were also looking at how that spot connected to the house, the barn, the equipment, and the driveways. There is nothing flashy about those details, but they are often what break a simple theory apart. Because even an accident has to make sense. Where a person came from, what they used to get there, why they ended up in that exact spot, and why they could not get away. Then one fact came up that sharply changed the direction of the investigation. A round was found in the remains near the rib area. From that moment on, the explanation about a sudden medical emergency could no longer answer every question. Fire could destroy clothing, traces, and parts of the body, but it could not explain a firearm injury. After that, the house was examined in a different way. The lower level, where Gary spent a lot of his time, became a separate point of focus. Investigators found traces of blood there. Some of it was visible. Some of it was revealed with a special solution used when investigators need to locate traces that may have been cleaned up or are no longer easy to see with the naked eye. They also found another round inside the house. Later, it was connected to the same firearm as the round found in the remains, but the firearm itself was never found. That is an important detail. Investigators did not have the object they could simply place in front of a jury and say the whole mystery was solved. By that point, the accident theory no longer held up, but investigators still did not have the full picture of the crime. What they had were separate anchor points: the fire on the property, traces inside the house, the rounds, the equipment, and the lack of a clear route. Now they had to figure out who could have connected the house and the burn area into one chain of events, and who may have believed the fire would leave fewer questions than it actually did. Once the accident theory started falling apart, the conversations with Gary's family changed. Before that, they were a family that had found someone close to them under awful circumstances. Now investigators had to ask uncomfortable questions. Who had access to the house? Who was nearby? Who had conflicts with Gary? And who might have benefited from his death? At first, Melody was seen as the wife of the man who had passed. But in her conversations with investigators, She began talking not only about herself and Gary, but also about problems inside the family. She brought up tension between Gary and his sons, money, old arguments, and the fact that Gary often helped his grown sons and daughters, though he was not always happy about it. Scott came up especially often in that part of the story. He lived on the property, helped around the farm, and was closer than the others to the place where the remains were found. For the investigation, that mattered not as a ready-made accusation, but as a fact of access. A person who lives near the main house knows the farm differently than someone who only comes by from time to time. A separate issue came up with footage from a camera on the property. After the remains were found, there was discussion that some of the data on the storage device had been deleted. Scott explained it as a normal habit of clearing old recordings, but that day was far too important for investigators to ignore a detail like that. When someone disappears and remains are later found on the same property, any camera footage or stored data becomes important. Christopher was also not left out of the broader review. He and Gary had financial issues between them. That does not make him guilty, and it should not sound like an accusation. But in a case like this, law enforcement has to look at everyone who had conflict, access to the family, and a possible motive. Melody also talked about other weak points in the family system. In her version of events, Gary increasingly looked like the person everyone came to for money, help, and decisions. And if you only listened to that side of the story, you could see a circle of people around him who depended on his support. But that created the opposite effect. The more actively Melody pointed to other people's motives, the more closely investigators looked at her. She lived in that house too. She knew the routine. She was part of the financial system. And unlike Gary's sons and daughters, she could have been directly affected by a divorce, or, on the other hand, could have kept her position after her husband's passing. Life insurance was also reviewed. A policy like that does not prove a crime on its own. But by that point, there were already hidden relationships, financial conflicts, unusual circumstances around Gary's passing, and questions about behavior after the discovery. So the insurance policy did not become some separate bombshell. It became one more part of the larger picture. Family members also talked about Melody's reaction, what she said about the funeral, and her interest in official documents. You cannot decide ahead of time how someone is supposed to react to a loss. But an investigation does not look at one emotion by itself. It looks at a sequence of actions. And in that sequence, more and more questions were starting to build around Melody. After looking into the family conflicts, investigators had to rebuild the timeline almost minute by minute. In a case like this, suspicions can sound serious, but they mean very little without a clear timeline. So Gary's phone, his movements, and his activity after returning to Purcell Lane became a major focus. On the evening of July 3rd, Gary was still alive. According to information later examined in the case materials, he left the farm at about 8:28 p.m., then stayed at a restaurant until 9:21 p.m. After that, his phone began moving back toward the house between roughly 9:26 and 9:32 p.m. That window matters because it shows that Gary returned to the property. He did not disappear somewhere along the way. After that, his normal activity changed sharply. For someone who was tied to work, family, and constant responsibilities, silence from his phone looked strange. But a phone by itself cannot tell you who was holding it. So investigators were not looking only at the fact that the device moved. They were looking at how that data lined up with the physical picture on the farm. This is where things get complicated. Gary's phone was still being detected on the property on July 4, and according to the case information, the last activity was recorded around 6:24 p.m. That did not automatically mean Gary was alive that entire time. That would have been too quick of a conclusion. The real question was different. Who could have been moving the phone after contact with Gary himself had essentially stopped? That same timeline also included a call from Melody to Scott about animals that had supposedly gotten out of their enclosure. On a farm, that can be a completely normal situation. But when you already have blood traces, firearm-related evidence, and remains found in the burn area, even an ordinary household call starts being checked not as a small detail, but as part of the larger schedule. Investigators also took a close look at Rusty Barton. His position was uncomfortable from the start. He was connected to the hidden part of Melody's life, so anything he said immediately mattered. Later, he spoke about a conversation in which Melody allegedly mentioned where Gary was before the official discovery had been made. That part of the case later became disputed, and Rusty did not come across as a witness who gave a simple, flawless version of events. But the question itself remained. Could Melody have known more than she was supposed to know at that moment? There was no complete recording of what happened. The materials from the property did not give investigators a ready-made answer. The firearm was never found. So the case did not rest on one single piece of proof. It rested on a chain. The time Gary returned, the phone activity that followed, the traces inside the house, the place where the remains were found, the behavior of the people involved, and the statements from those closest to him. That is how the circle narrowed. Not through some dramatic scene with one perfect piece of evidence, but through checking who was nearby, who knew the property, who had access to the house, and who could have controlled the events in a way that made them first look like an accident. After a long investigation, the case did not reach trial until 2024. By then, the jury was not just hearing a story about a man found on his own farm. They were being shown the full set of facts: a broken marriage, money, hidden relationships, disputed actions after Gary's passing, phone data, traces inside the house, and evidence that pushed investigators to treat what happened as a crime. The trial lasted almost 3 weeks. In the courtroom, they went through the phone timeline, testimony from relatives, the rounds, blood traces on the lower level, the insurance policy, Melody's relationship with Rusty, and her behavior after the remains were found. This was not a case with one single object that explained everything right away. The jury was asked to look at the chain of details. The defense tried to shift attention towards Scott. He had access to the property, he lived nearby, he knew the farm, and the issue with the deleted camera material from the property looked unclear. That strategy made sense. If there was another person close by who physically could have been in the right places at the right times, the defense had to put that possibility in front of the jury. The prosecution built a different picture. Melody lived in the house. She knew the routine. She had access to the area where the traces were found, and she was tied to the financial side of the marriage. Rusty's statement also became important. The part where he said, Melody allegedly knew about the location connected to Gary's remains before that information was officially known. That detail was not perfectly clean or simple, but the court considered it together with the rest of the evidence. On November 4th, 2024, the jury found Melody Ferris guilty on the main counts. Those included the most serious crime charge, serious assault, concealing a death, and making a false statement to law enforcement. She did not admit guilt. There was no confession in this story. Later, after the verdict and before sentencing, Melody continued to deny involvement and pointed back to Scott. But the court did not accept that theory as an explanation for the entire chain of events. On December 5th, 2024, she was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 5 years. She can ask for parole only after 30 years. In the end, this case did not come down to one single piece of evidence or one witness. The court looked at the place, the timing, the access, the phone data, the blood traces, the rounds, the money, the hidden relationship, and the behavior after Gary's passing. Each element on its own could be argued, but together they formed a picture the jury found strong enough for a guilty verdict in the case of Gary Wayne Ferris's death.
Support us by liking and subscribing. Share your theories in the comments. Until next time, stay vigilant.